Today, we are very honored to have Louis Volante, who's a professor of education at Brock University in Canada, Niagara Falls. And he's a professorial fellow at the United Nations University in Maastricht Economic and Social Research Institute on Innovation and Technology, which is known by most of us as the Maastricht Graduate School of Governance, which is a known center for their welfare state research. He is also the president-elect of the Canadian Society for the Study of Education. And Louis works in the area of global education policies and performance monitoring and transnational governance, inequality in educational opportunities and outcomes, and impact evaluation of policies and programs in general. I have Louis' last book, courtesy of Louis. Thank you so much for having this super interesting book, an edited volume on the PISA effect on global education governance, for those people who want to see the book here, so to the camera. This book, the edited volume book, has a number of chapters by a lot of people that I have recognized names from the literature on understanding educational inequalities, measurement, and so on. So I was extremely interested in reading the book. Thank you so much. We are looking forward to hearing your talk on PISA, political discourse, and education governance in the age of global reference societies. Floor is yours, Louis. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I just want to thank Berkay for organizing this, and Timo as well. And also for you for joining today. What I'm going to share with you is basically a potpourri of different pieces of research that are reflected in different publications, and you'll see that at the very end of the presentation. I'll show you the works cited, but it's based on a 5-year research grant that I have that's funded by the Social Science and Humanities Research Council of Canada. That's really the main funding organization in Canada for social science and humanities research, which includes economics and political science, obviously. And I would say I'm probably 3/4 of the way through this grant. So it's a 2017 and 2022 study, but because of COVID, it's been extended an additional year. So I'm going to probably wrap it up next spring. So I will make reference to different pieces of work, and what's nice is that some of these pieces of work are already out there, others are in press. So I know obviously for some of you this might be very very simplistic stuff that we're going to talk about initially, but I don't know the level of understanding different individuals have in terms of what PISA is and what it looks like. Don't worry, I don't like to read things verbatim, but I do want to emphasize a couple of key points. There's been also some changes to this assessment framework that are taking place. Some of them have been precipitated by COVID, but more often than not, the changes have come in relation to just our changing understanding of, how can we capture the quote unquote knowledge and skills that we think are necessary for students to move on and have a healthy and productive life. What I would start off with is just simply to state that, PISA has been around since 2000, and it's a triennial test. So it's given every 3 years. We've had 7 administrations. We were actually supposed to have a 2021 test, but because of COVID, that's been pushed to 2022. So we've had 2000, 2003, 6, 9, 12, 15, and 18 thus far. You can see from the second bullet the scale of it, right? So we're talking about 500,000 15-year-olds in 80 countries / economies. The reason why the / economies is noteworthy is because in some parts of the world, you will see individual regions within a country represented. So you might see Shanghai, China, or Macau. For the most part, the vast majority of contexts are reporting at the national level. So you'll see an aggregate or averages for different countries around the world. The UK, of course, has their results reported both ways, which means that they have an overall average for the UK, but then they also disaggregate for Wales and England and Northern Ireland and Scotland, much like Canada, which has Canadian average, but because education is a provincial responsibility, we disaggregate the results and report those. Report those at the provincial level. The third bullet talks about some recent changes. So in the sense that, it's always looked at rating math and science literacy, but new tests are being introduced, like, financial literacy or global competencies. There's a creative thinking test that's being developed for the next iteration, which is coming hopefully this spring, and then foreign languages in 2025. So just a brief point. If you look at the literature in this area, most of the people that do research in this topic, including those that are very, very arm's length from the OECD, and I guess I should say, for the interest of full disclosure, that, I've been probably one of the few people that have probably taken a more measured and balanced assessment of the OECD's role in education. You tend to have two extremes, right? You have people that are vehement critics, and then you have people that are adamant supporters. And the book that Berkay flashed, just a funny little quick story, is when I was recruiting individuals to contribute to this volume, I had individuals that said, yes, absolutely, I want to work with you, Louis, on this volume. And then when they saw the list of authors represented, I'd have different people saying, well, no, I don't want to work on this volume anymore because, this person has a completely different view. And I didn't lose any contributors, because I said to them, I said to these individuals, at the end of the day, we need to try to represent as many different viewpoints on this topic as possible. And we can't just, shout to each other in a hollow chamber. We need to hear from different perspectives and different views. So I think I've been able to do that in my career. PISA has 7 levels of attainment, proficiency, and starting with 1B is the lowest. Level 2 is the minimal proficiency level. So when you hear discussions, maybe even news reports saying, so-and-so students from this country are high achievers, they don't really mean they're high in the sense that they're level 6 or 7. They're really just referring to the proportion that are level 3 or above. So that's an interesting piece of information that often gets buried in conversations around PISA, particularly with politicians that are discussing, the merits of their education system. So just some general trends to consider. The two main ways of using PISA is in relation to overall performance. And then, of course, we look at equity in terms of achievement gaps. An education system is said to be, quote unquote, effective, or a good education system if it has both, if it has high achievement and it has low differences between the top quartile and the bottom quartile. So they're really looking at, the top 25% of students and the bottom 25%. Now, in terms of equity, there's different ways to look at it. You can look at equity primarily through a socioeconomic lens, but I've also looked at results in relation to migrant status. So the OECD, when they look at equity and when they put out reports related to this issue, they're usually looking at SES, migrant status, and gender, male versus females, because we've known for probably 50, 60 years that there's a significant difference between male and female students in particular domains. And this wouldn't surprise anyone. It's pretty common knowledge. More recently, there's been discussion around capturing those students that are resilient. So those are the students that are reflected in the bottom 20% of the socioeconomic measure. So it's the measure that captures the degree of wealth or affluence or socioeconomic status of the individual test taker. And of course, it's a rough proxy. It's not a perfect measure because it's relying on a number of different things, for instance, parental education, which doesn't always capture it. I think of my own parents. I mean, probably if I had to write this test 40 years ago, my SES status might not be captured completely perfectly because, you know, my father had a grade 6 education, my mother had a grade 2 education. They both went through the war in Europe and they didn't really have an opportunity to go to school. The last thing I want to mention is just the scale, the scores. So you're seeing the average scores on the bottom there. So it's a scaled score. What I think is important for you to understand is roughly 30 scale points is equivalent to a grade range. So when politicians will say, you know, our 15-year-olds are 2 grade levels below Singaporean students, they might, their students might be at an average of 500 and a Singaporean average might be 560. So this number of 30, and it's roughly, because in some administrations it's higher or slightly lower, but roughly 30 is something that is important from a policy perspective, because when you're looking at achievement gaps, this is how international comparative measures are often discussed in public discourse in terms of these grade level differences. I wish I could talk about this slide at great extent. I honestly could give a 2-hour lecture just on this one slide and have given a 2-hour lecture on these issues, but obviously I don't have time to do that today. Suffices to say, it's important for you to understand when you look at all these different factors that some of these characteristics or features reside within a school and some of them reside outside of school. So for the quantitative folks over there, you know, it's kind of like a within and between factor design, or, you know, a multi-level analysis where you're trying to basically capture the amount of unique variance within a test score that might be attributable to gender or SES or parent education. The one that's bolded is the school system features, because that is the one that governments, for the most part, have really quite direct control over in terms of how they structure their education system. I've done some work in the UK. Actually, I was part of the evaluation team 20 years ago for Tony Blair's government when they were evaluating the national literacy and numeracy strategies. Probably those of you that are under 40 might have experienced that as a student. The people over 50 might have experienced it as an adult and, you know, had that perspective. But obviously, I can talk a little bit more at length about the UK system and how it differs from other systems and some of those unique features, and I'll show you that. And then when you start moving down this list, you're going to more macro level policies and macro level issues, right? So social welfare provisions or the level of income inequality can be a significant predictor of achievement gaps within a country, as an example, right? That shouldn't surprise anyone. And also immigration and multicultural policies for those countries that have significantly high immigrant student populations. Canada is a perfect example. We have essentially 30% of all our students are either first or second generation immigrants. In my province, it's 40%. In the city of Toronto, which is our largest city, it's around 50%. So you can see different countries have different levels of immigration, and obviously that might be a consideration in terms of the types of policies that they have. I wanted to quickly show you a table that kind of summarizes some of the differences in terms of funding and school choice. I've written at length about school choice options around the world and the impact of those options on student outcomes, okay, including achievement, but not just achievement. It could be graduation rates. It could be progression towards post-secondary environments. So you can see quite clearly that the UK is quite an outlier. And even though I've only shown you 4 other countries, I think if you were to see this full graph, and I've provided the link, and you can have a copy of the slides, you'll see that even in relation to a much longer list, the UK is somewhat of an outlier in terms of the way their schools are funded and the variety of choice they've had. And this has really been going on for about 40 years now, well, 35, 40 years since Margaret Thatcher's government introduced a number of structural reforms to the British education systems. Why did I put Finland, Sweden, and Denmark? Well, I put those three countries in particular because they have the highest global social mobility, the highest on the global social mobility index. And I put Estonia because Estonia has tended to be a very interesting country of late when you look at PISA. So, you know, the title of my talk is around global reference societies. All that really means is, what are the countries that other countries draw from in terms of either justifying a particular policy reform in education or trying to borrow a particular policy that they think might lead to similar levels of success. And in some cases, it's essentially borrowing to justify a decision that has already been made pre-release of the results. And that's something we'll get to later in the talk. So just a quick history lesson of the OECD. I mean, they've really been involved in education since the early 1960s. They really provided the impetus for this new field of economics of education, which is really essentially an input-output model. It's trying to look at, okay, what do you put into an education system and how can you measure those outputs? One of the outputs is student achievement. Other outputs could be things like graduation rates, which vary significantly across countries, right? You have countries like Japan and Finland with a 99% high school graduation rate, and other countries with significantly lower graduation rates. So that's a huge consideration if you want to think about human capital. And, you know, there's some folks out there that have done research to actually put a number on, you know, how much will a particular country gain if their graduation rate were to go up. I can tell you in Canada, if our overall high school completion rate went from 93% to 94%, it would be in the billions of dollars that the economy would save, because these analyses that are being done don't just look at earnings, it also looks at other impacts such as health and well-being. So for instance, people that don't graduate from high school or secondary school tend to have lower health outcomes. So it's quite complex. There's a lot of good work that's being done, but it's just essentially the idea of how to capture the importance of these different issues and tied to particular policies. So really they've moved from thinking about just capturing the years of education to quality. And that has been a significant shift over the last 20, 30 years in terms of this field, to not just quantify the number of years students spend in school, but to capture the quality of the experience as well. And from the OECD's perspective, I mean, you can go to their website and you'll see the tagline, better policies for better lives, right? And the whole idea of PISA, the PISA program in particular, is to provide a measure that can help evaluate the effectiveness of education systems and the fine-tuning of education policies. Now, this fine-tuning is probably the most contentious issue because for some people, they find that the role or the influence of the OECD is too pronounced, it's too stark, and it takes away from more contextual issues within a national jurisdiction. So I've given you sort of a broad overview of the measure itself. Now I'm going to start shifting into more of the governance aspects of this particular body, international organization, and the PISA measure in particular. So what you see in the title there is soft law, but you know, some people refer to it as soft power. The reason why we refer to it as soft law or soft power is because the OECD's recommendations are just that. They're recommendations. They're not binding. There's no legislative authority when the OECD goes in and gives you country-specific recommendations, CSRs, I mean, you're free to ignore them. And to be quite honest with you, I'm currently working with the OECD on a country review. I can't really reveal the details, but we're going to provide a report. And of course, it's up to the government if they want to use those suggestions that we offer, right? And it's actually a government in Europe, not too far from you, but the report will come out shortly. What people have said about the OECD's role in the education sphere is that they've been primarily focused on a neoliberal orientation. But there's some dispute about that, because if you actually look at their policies, they've been very focused on things like child development as well as equity issues. So from that perspective, for the people that are in favor of the OECD's role, they have sharpened the lens of governments to look at, you know, the attainment distribution of students within their country, whether it's based on gender, immigrant status, more often than not, socioeconomic status. So that, I think, from that perspective, is a movement away. And by the way, I'm not the first to make this statement. To be quite honest with you, there's a journal, I think it's Global Social Policy. There's a journal that a number of political scientists have written pieces on this particular issue, and they've sort of cataloged the change or the evolution of the OECD's perspective over time. So I'm going to show you a story from The Guardian quickly, and then hopefully I can get back to my slides. So yes, I'm happy. So this is from The Guardian. Now, The Guardian put out this story in 2014, I believe, and it was, the title of it, OECD and PISA tests are damaging education worldwide. And they outline a litany of problems with the test. And here you have the list of signatories, which is quite significant. Stephen Ball, who you might know from the IOE, the book that Berkay showed you, Goldstein, who the late Harvey Goldstein, he actually was one of the first victims of Corona. He passed away in April at the beginning of the pandemic, sadly. So this list was actually extended. I had let's see if I can get out of here. Oops. I had a paper that was in press for this particular journal called Policy Futures in Education. I got an email that one morning, and they said, we're going to have to bump you to the next issue, because they actually reposted this letter. And then they had a response from the director of education for the OECD, Andre Schleicher, and the list of signatories grew. So to say that it's sort of a balanced debate is somewhat misleading, the statement that I made. I would say probably 3 or 4 out of 5 academics in the social sciences have tended to take a much more pessimistic view of the OECD's role in education. I mean, that would be an interesting study to just do a large-scale survey and get a sense of it. In terms of how their policy works and how they influence national policies, okay, there are national reports that go to specific countries, and there's country-specific recommendations. In Europe, you're no longer part of the EU, but in Europe, there's also the European semester approach, which looks at a number of key outcomes, one of which is literacy and numeracy. So they use PISA as part of this European semester approach, and you used to use it as well. If I'm being quite honest, I actually gave a talk literally 6 days before Brexit in Cardiff in Wales. And I was discussing this particular issue in terms of the policy outreach of the OECD. So here are the links, but I mean, we're in the hundreds now. So if you look at PISA in Focus, it's basically a policy brief that tackles a particular issue. But in every single policy brief, there is a lesson learned. I guess the last one I want to show you is the education GPS. So if I were to analyze by country, I can click on UK and it provides me with basically a figure to represent your education system. And it shows you for England, Northern Ireland, Scotland, but more importantly, you can click on different reports within this particular education GPS website. Just close this. So far, so good. I'm not going to spend too much time on human capital theory. I think you know what it is. I really want to get to the meaty part of the presentation, which is looking at some of the cases that are reflected in a recent paper that I've done for Oxford University Press. So, I mean, John Jerem and I don't know if any of you know John. John is a professor at the IOE. We work together on a couple of things, including an edited volume, not the one Berkay has, but another one that came out in 2019. And what John and I did pre this volume was actually look at the relationship between human capital, particular test scores, not necessarily PISA. We actually looked at PIAC and income inequality in different countries, and I'll get to that in a second. But what you see there are three main facets of human capital theory that relate to education. I guess the last one is the one that we think of the most, right? That, you know, obviously human capital and family background is an important consideration in terms of disadvantage. And obviously, what would be the leveler for that? What would be the equalizer? Well, it's this notion of meritocracy tied to education. So the dominant narrative is obviously, if you go to school, you do well, you can change your social status and your economic circumstances. I briefly alluded to the Global Social Mobility Index. I'm just showing you the top 10 countries there. The reason why I'm showing you these countries is because I'm going to segue into the study that John and I, well, it's not really a study, but the paper that we put out for the World Economic Forum on this area. So those are the top 10 countries. Obviously, the Nordic countries are the highest. You see the UK is ranked 21st and the US is ranked 27th. They have, you know, obviously that's a consideration. But I think the important point here is, and for those of you that don't know, PIAC is basically PISA for 16 to 65-year-olds. So it's the same kind of test. It's designed similar in terms of the overall structure of it. It's a cross-national sample. But what John did was look at the PIAC data, and he compared it to the scores in terms of the education, their education, and then the labor market outcomes in terms of income. And what I bolded there is essentially the important part, which is in those countries you see in the second bullet, a parent's education has little impact on a child's income. But in the final bullet, you'll see countries like France, Japan, South Korea, and the UK. Even though those individuals had the same qualifications, their parents' education could predict a 20% difference in income. And this is, you know, rather disturbing because obviously, you know, your students are listening online. I mean, maybe they graduate from LSE with a master's degree or a PhD. They wouldn't expect to make less money based on their parental education, based on their parents' education. I mean, that would be quite disturbing for me, given the education levels of my parents that I just mentioned earlier on in the presentation. So I've provided the link. John used the Gini coefficient here to show this relationship. So for the last 15, 20 minutes, I'd really like to focus on the most recent paper that I have in press that covers, these particular contexts. I probably have to shorten it, maybe 15 minutes. Is that okay, Berkay? Okay. So what I did is I looked at some highly reactive policy contexts in different parts of the world. Now, this term reactivity, it's been around for a while. Simon Breakspear did a review for the OECD years ago, and he basically tried to gauge the level of reactivity across all of the different countries that participated in terms of how invested in the results are they in terms of using it for policy reform. So what I've done here is I've showed you 4 countries, and I've given you a sort of quick synopsis of them, and I'm going to cover those in more detail. So what you have, Germany, I don't think anyone can discuss PISA without talking about Germany first and foremost, because when you think about the German system, no country in the world has really revamped their education system to the level or the degree to which Germany did. It was largely precipitated by quite lackluster results in the initial administration in 2000. You can see they did quite poorly in the 20s, in 22nd or 21st. And they essentially, as a result of that, brought in a number of structural reforms to their education system. And they essentially moved away from a traditional liberal arts view of education. What's interesting about the German context is at the time they were making these structural reforms, they were referencing the Finnish system. So the Finnish system tends to have a much more traditional liberal arts orientation to it. It's not top heavy in terms of accountability policies. It's not a system that's driven by testing. So the irony of the sort of reforms that they brought in, while they were referencing the success of the Finnish system, is they were bringing in reforms that are essentially a standards-based reform model that largely began with Margaret Thatcher's government, this whole idea of this close coupling of testing with accountability and an output model. So, there was very little resistance in the German context by politicians on both sides or on the various parties, because the media attention to this issue was so intense that everybody sort of acquiesced to the number of reforms that were brought in. And those were brought in across the entire country, and their Länder is, like me saying province in Canada. The English system is interesting as well. And I've mentioned Margaret Thatcher already. But what's interesting about the English system, the reason why it's characterized as a U-turn is that initially England was not looking to borrow or learn from other high-performing jurisdictions because they tended to view themselves as a strong education system. Now, you should know that the initial results for the UK were not released because there were some sampling issues. So even though there were problems that were in the data set, they were largely ignored. So there were some equity concerns even in the initial data set, but the overall performance seemed to be quite high. What it did, though, was that those initial results, which were considered stronger, lended further support to the Education Reform Act. So here's an interesting thing for you to understand, that in some cases, PISA results are used to justify existing reforms, and in other cases, they're used to justify newer reforms if the results go down. So if the results are high, and this is a pattern you see in different parts of the world. So if the results are strong, they're used to lend further support to the existing system. If the results are lower, then they're used to introduce newer reforms. The last bullet relates to Michael Gove. I'm sure many of you know of him, but he essentially brought in this idea, not on his own, of course, but starting to look more eastward. So to looking at the Asian countries that were starting to quickly dominate at the top of the league tables, like Shanghai and Singapore as an example. The Japanese system is quite similar to the German in the sense that they kind of moved away from a low pressure curriculum to a more centralized model. What's interesting about the Japanese system, and Takayama actually outlines this in some of his publications, is the decisions to reform the Japanese education system. Those decisions were actually made prior to the release of the results. Then when the results were released, they were reverse engineered to justify a reform that was already decided pre-release of those results. They seem to be going through a second wave of reforms right now, in the sense that they're starting to now not just, they've sort of moved away from the Finnish model because based on the initial success, and now they're comparing them more to Asian nations. There's some interesting geopolitics going on here when it comes to global reference societies. So the Japanese could have easily borrowed or looked east within their own region, but that was not palatable for them. So they initially moved towards the Finnish model initially, even though the reforms they brought in, much like the German reforms, were not were the complete opposite of what you see in Japan. And then finally, I'll just end off with Canada. I only have about 5 more minutes left. So the interesting thing about Canada is we don't have a federal minister of education. We don't have a federal ministry of education. So really, when it comes to policy borrowing and trying to learn from one another, we don't tend to look at other countries. We tend to borrow from within our own country because there are 10 different provincial education systems, and the level, the achievement gaps or the achievement differences from one province to the next, going back to an earlier point I made about, 30 scaled points is equivalent to 1 grade level. Well, we have some provinces that are 45 scale points different from the top to the bottom. So the difference between, say, Alberta in mathematics or British Columbia in science and Saskatchewan is a grade and a half level difference for a province that you share a border with. That's significant. Why are there such significant differences in achievement? I guess the other thing I'd mention about Canada, it's not on the slide here, is that PISA has been used to also create negative perceptions of regional differences, much like what you see in Italy. So, I mean, I've talked about the Italian context in a different paper, but you see the regional differences and politicians talking about referring to PISA when they're justifying particular reforms or economic reforms in relation to that based on regional differences. Most notably in Italy would be between Northern Italy and Southern Italy. And Daniele Checchi, I don't know if you know Daniele Checchi, he's an economist in Milan who wrote a chapter in the book that Berkay was showing you, talking about these, he does talk about these regional differences. Stefano Versilio also contributed, and he's at the Joint Research Center. I don't have time to go into this paper, but it is online. What I would say, it's open access. So anyone can have access to it, can look at it. So what I did in this particular paper, which is in the journal European Education, is I kind of document the policy responses within these 3 particular countries, Italy, France, and Finland. The reason why I refer to Finland as policy refraction is they are seen to be focusing now on specific issues because they've dropped substantially over the last 7 administrations. They were number one, and now they've moved down. Estonia is really the European reference society now. Most countries in Europe, when they talk about reforms in the education domain, most politicians are referencing the Estonian education system for a number of reasons, not just because the results are high, but also because their GDP and the amount of per pupil funding that they have is not substantial. Poland is also, it's not on in this paper, but Poland's also another interesting context because the results are quite significant in terms of achievement, and yet their portfolio in education, or the amount of funding that they provide in education, is quite modest. So I'll just end with this, and I'm happy to take questions. And I really scratched the surface here in terms of covering some of the key concepts in this topic. But what I've proposed with some of my colleagues is a multi-level model in terms of not just looking at it in terms of what impacts student achievement, but what policies impact students that relate to individual schools and families and communities, as well as the host society. So, I mean, these circles aren't to scale. We always start with the student. So how does an education policy directly impact an individual student in an individual school? And then how do policies that strengthen families or communities or a country as a whole impact that individual student? What I would say is much of the political discourse in terms of education reform over the last 30 years has been focused primarily on the school. Some would say, well, that's a neoliberal orientation that's designed to put the sole emphasis on schools, which then detracts from all these other broader features outside of schools that have a significant influence on student achievement. And then for those of you that have a background in measurement and evaluation, in terms of unique variance, the factors within the school contribute to student outcomes, but the ones outside of school have a much more profound influence, if I'm being honest. And yet most of the focus has been on system design and less so on some of these other characteristics that have been known to lead to positive outcomes for students. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Louis. It's very thought-provoking, and I want to, like, if you can stop sharing your screen now, then maybe we can see the hands and other people for questions. I do have a bunch of questions of my own, but I'm sure that a lot of people might have other questions first. So from this room, so I don't see any hands on the Zoom from this room, Stephen. So you want to go on?
Hi, Louis. I'm Stephen Jenkins. Thank you very much for your talk. I've done some stuff on segregation using PISA a long time ago. Bit like equality of opportunity, nobody would probably say they don't like to have a better performing education system. Okay, it's a goal everybody agrees with, but how do we know that a system is performing better? Answer, presumably we need some sort of benchmark, and this brings in the role of the OECD. So I'm wondering if you've talked about this two-way battle about what the OECD does or doesn't, and I'm not sure whether or not, in relation to the benchmarks that PISA provides, whether or not the argument is about a disagreement between using national benchmarks, okay, which will either be changes over time for a small country or maybe across provinces in a country like Canada, or is it antipathy towards testing per se, and there's quite a lot of that about, and more generally against benchmarking of any kind? I mean, there are, I guess, multiple ways of attacking it. I'm not sure where all these people are coming from. So, I mean, just from looking at your chapter headings, I can see elements of that, but I'm wondering what the crucial elements are.
Yeah, I mean, you touched on a number of different themes. I mean, we could have a really robust discussion. So like in terms of the antipathy to testing, I definitely understand that, because national policies around testing are obviously going to influence how you feel about international testing measures. It doesn't matter that there's a complete difference. There's a significant difference between a census style test, right? Like think of the GCSEs in England, right? As opposed to using a sample, right? A stratified purposeful sample that the OECD is using at the country level. But, you know, another layer on top of that is then what happens to your national assessment systems? Are they being unduly influenced? So as an example, you know, the PISA framework is was adopted in Germany. So their national assessments began to mimic what PISA was doing. And many would say, well, why are we doing the exact same thing? We should be doing different things, right? Because if you're testing different things, you're getting different perspectives and you're sort of flattening out the error that could be attributable to any one measure, right? It wasn't just Germany. Ireland did it. Canada does it. So our Pan-Canadian assessment program is basically given to 13-year-olds, and it's identical to the PISA design. 2/3 of the items are in, you know, reading, math, or science, the other third. So it's the same framework. So that's the one issue in terms of testing. And testing has always obviously conjured up, you know, images of, you know, all of the unintended negative consequences, the washback effects, the teaching to the test, the narrowing of the curriculum, the higher stress for students. I mean, you know, I've been on PhD examination committees for students defending their thesis. One student was talking about Nepal and how the suicide rate went up substantially in that country based on a change in the national assessments that are so high stakes for them. So I think part of your criticism is well-founded, that some of the probably criticism that the OECD gets is always going to be part of this. They're always going to be fielding those types of criticisms because they're using a benchmark. But I will say one thing. The OECD's position in this area is not fixed. It has shifted. There's a tacit acknowledgement from the OECD in relation to those criticisms. So if you take a look at the Guardian article that I showed you, one of the criticisms is the narrow focus. Well, since that article was published, the OECD has introduced measures around global competency, financial literacy. Now you're seeing creative thinking. There'll be a digital learning. So there's a tacit acknowledgement that their measure can't do everything it purports to do, which is measure all the knowledge and skills that are necessary to be a functioning adult. And André Schleicher even said in an actual presentation he gave about a year or two ago that, you know, any measure that uses multiple choice, when they don't just rely on multiple choice, they are constrained by that, right? By what they can measure. I mean, I do some research in the area of resilience, and one of the things that I talk about is this disconnect between academic resilience, which is just doing well academically, and other factors related to resilience. I think if COVID's taught us anything, mental and physical health are equally important, but might not be measured in the same way as reading, math, and science. Maybe governments need to start paying more attention to these non-cognitive skills. I gave a presentation for ETS, which is Education Testing Services, similar to Cambridge assessments in the UK. And about a week ago, around non-cognitive assessment. So I do think the testing field is changing. Maybe if we start looking at non-cognitive issues, maybe parents and educators and teachers might be a little less resistant to the fact that we are using these benchmarks to help improve an education system.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louis, and thanks, Stephen, for the question. So we have Vicente, would you like?
Sure. Hi, Louis. Thanks for your presentation. Vicente Silva here. I wanted to ask mainly two things that were kind of implicit in the presentation, but I think that are quite important to understand your research project in general. The first has to do with the theoretical background. I think that the case that you showed could be a clear case of institutional isomorphism. It made me think about the work of American sociologist Ramirez, Mayer, and that bunch of American sociologists, because we can see that there's these institutional templates that are created and proposed by international organizations through benchmarking. But I don't know if in your own research, your idea of policy diffusion sees it more as a kind of emulation, adaptation, maybe mediated by political interests, or as a process of learning that could be more rational. And I think all of those different perspectives lead to different theories as well. So I wanted to know your opinion about that. How does policy diffusion work in these specific cases? And the maybe the second question, more brief, is that the reference to the geopolitical context. I found it interesting in your model that wasn't really specified, especially if we consider that the OECD has been transitioning, as you were saying, towards or moving away from neoliberalism in general, adapting a more Nordic approach, especially in labor policy, which is the field that I'm working on. And I would like you to tell us a little bit about that. If in education that's been the case, if we could see, for example, the specific benchmarks or the reference societies they choose as part of a broader political project of the OECD, not necessarily as the only result of their quantifications, if that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to try to remember. I want to go back to the first question. So the first question, I mean, for the people listening, most of the conversation in the education sphere is use this term evidence-based policies, right? On one extreme, you have evidence-based policies. On the opposite extreme, you have opinion-based policies. And in the middle, you have evidence-informed policies. Most Western governments tend to operate in this middle sort of area, meaning, they might have good evidence to, for instance, reduce class size in the primary grades, but they might be within a political party that is, not promoting that as a particular policy plank. So they can be selective. The other area to think about, and it's layered on top of this sort of narrative around evidence-informed, evidence-based, is this rational choice theories that you might be familiar with, this notion that we choose particular policies that make sense in the local context. I'm working on a paper right now that actually addresses your first question. I'm going to submit it to a journal called Discourse, Cultural Politics of Education. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but the idea is myself and my colleagues, we're developing this theory called cognitive situated governance, which essentially is a way of looking at this relation between rational choice and cognitive governance models. And it's really essentially looking at this evidentiary symbolism, meaning the symbolism that is attached to particular evidence that is used by politicians to promote a reform. So, Michael Gove would use the symbolism of the Singaporean system in terms of merit-based pay to help justify introducing merit-based pay, which, based on the evidence, is largely ineffective. Merit-based pay structures do not work if you look at the international literature. So I think there's these two kind of areas that often get discussed when you think of the theoretical orientation, looking at, how policies make it from paper into actual implementation, and what are the sort of networks that they have to go through in order to sort of go through these hoops. I had a PhD student who works in Whitehall which you would know. She did her PhD with me at UNU with Mark Bevere, and I supervise her. He's, you might know Mark Bevere, he's at Berkeley. He does stuff in British governance. And she also looked at, she used a network theory to understand the resits policy in the UK, meaning the students that fail the GSEC, I always get the acronym screwed up, but, and then they have to resit it. Yeah, it's a mouthful. You know how many acronyms there are in education? 1,000. But anyways, the network, she did a network analysis, and it was quite interesting for Jillian to draw this thread through to understand how that policy was initially conceptualized and made it into practice. And it's not based on evidence necessarily, right? It's all those sort of political considerations. The key is, how do you apply that across contexts, right? How do you understand those differences? No one model would actually predict why would one country do, take two countries with identical results going in completely different trajectories. Now, your second question, can you help refresh me? Because it was some time ago.
Yeah, on the geopolitical context and the OECD's political project, if you want.
Yeah, so I'm not looking at it from the OECD's lens when I look at neopolitical context. I'm using the neopolitical context to understand what's going on within a particular country. So as an example, I've done some work looking at migrant integration, right? So how well do immigrant students do in national education systems? It's fascinating. In the UK, there's been a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment, despite the fact that, you know, the UK, if you look at the entire European Union and then you put the UK results there, there's no performance disadvantage. There's no difference between your first and second generation immigrants and your non-immigrant students. There tends to be a performance gap there. We call it a performance disadvantage. Usually immigrants tend to be 30 scale points below their non-immigrant same age peers. There's some countries that buck that trend. As an example, Canadian immigrant students outperform their non-immigrant peers. We're an exception to the rule. But what's interesting around this neopolitical context is at the same time, there was a lot of anti-immigrant sentiment around the world. The discourse within your particular country was quite negative towards immigrant students. And yet, if you look at their educational outcomes, they're largely indistinguishable from your non-immigrant from their non-immigrant counterparts. I mean, the performance differences are quite negligible. I mean, at least they were the last time I checked. The MIPEX, which is Migrant Integration Policy Index, which you can Google it. There's the, you can actually see the comparative data for that, shows that. So to get to your earlier point, I'm not really focused on the OECD's overall influence in terms of the geopolitical context. I'm trying to understand how the geopolitical context influences national policy reforms. So I'm doing it the other way around. It's in reverse.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Johan.
Thank you, Berkay. Hi, Louis. My name's Johan. A question not from the perspective of someone who does ed policy, but rather from the perspective of someone who does criminal justice policy. And it's a question about those countries that are at the other end of the distribution to which you're referring, rather than the countries that refer to the global reference societies. I'm really interested in the ones that accept themselves, that remove themselves from playing this game. The reason I introduced this by saying from the perspective of a criminologist is that a lot of what you were saying today reminds me of the literature from a decade, 2 decades ago about CompStat. The proliferation of police officers having to point to other how other police officers, or in some instances when CompStat really proliferated, police chiefs pointing at other police chiefs, saying that person is doing it better or worse than me. One of the really interesting findings to come out of all of that scholarship was not just the rhetorical moves people would make to be able to say why I'm going to measure myself up against my neighbor. Rather, that some of the really interesting stuff was those instances when people offered rhetorical deflections of the sort that I shouldn't be held up to the same standard as that person, because fundamentally what we do here when we police is a different thing than what is being done over there. And I'm curious whether you can share anything about how maybe there are instances among these 80 countries that participate in PISA where they'll say, you know what, it is just misguided to hold me to the global reference society like Estonia. I hope that question makes sense.
Probably wouldn't.
No, it absolutely does. And I mean, just to be quite honest with you, if you read some of my stuff, I've been very, very critical of countries that quote unquote borrow policies. I mean, does it make any sense for a country like Japan to want to borrow policies from a country like Finland? I think it's laughable, quite honestly, that our Minister of Education in Ontario invited the Finnish minister. You're talking about the most homogeneous student population in Western Europe, somehow having lessons that they can impart for Canada, which is the most heterogeneous student population in the Western world. So I don't want you to leave with the impression that I support policy borrowing or to that extent. But to your initial question, are there countries out there that are not playing this game? Of course there are. I mean, you know, there's countries like France and Italy are two perfect examples. They're not as concerned about you know, PISA results, but at the same time, it's not that they're not concerned because they don't believe the data is valid or valuable. It's for other reasons that they're ignoring that data. And it's, you know, in Italy, it would be because of the political instability. We're talking about dozens and dozens of governments over a 50, 60-year period. So there's largely a difficulty in bringing in any systemic reforms under such political instability over time. But, you know, I mean, I haven't looked at countries, you know, all 80 of the countries. I primarily focused on Western Europe and North America and Australasia in the work that I've done. I've given you those 4 countries as being examples of highly reactive policy contexts. Simon's work suggests that, and it's dated, so you can't really use it now, that there's a significant range. And to be fair to the OECD, they've even said, you know, the amount of reforms that they've recommended versus those that have actually been implemented is quite small. And I would actually agree with them. So I think what you're seeing here is this sort of this tension between what they consider evidence and what they'd like to selectively use to actually bring in reforms. So I don't know if that answers your question. I'm happy to take a follow-up if you're not satisfied. Okay.
Thank you so much, Johan and Louis. And do we have any questions from the Zoom, or do we have any other questions from the room? Didn't want to rhyme. I do have a question if no one is asking. So a follow-up question to Johan's. All I was thinking about, like you started saying that PISA now includes 80 countries, but we have heard about the Western advanced industrialized societies and their patterns and differences. Those 80 countries include now Morocco, Peru, Latin American countries, as well as Asian African countries too. And I was wondering whether adding more countries diluted somewhat the focus on the between country gaps versus we should be turning into within country. And then following what Johan says, many of these countries experienced also educational attainment changes. They have gone through this compulsory schooling reforms that increase the number of years of schooling. So then the attention is now gradually turning into achievement rather than attainment. And I was wondering whether like that discourse of adding more heterogeneous countries with different histories of compulsory schooling would shift somewhat the focus on let's not benchmark ourselves to Estonia anymore, then think about education by context or not.
Yeah, I mean, is it fair for a lower income country to compare themselves to a middle higher income country. I don't think so. The other thing is that's just the 80 you've mentioned, but there's also the PISA for Development program, which is a program designed to essentially bring in PISA into lower income countries, mostly in Latin America and South Asia. So yeah, the testing apparatus and the scale and the reach is expanded. I personally am of the opinion that there needs to be much more safeguards put in place. But at the same time, and I'm not the OECD, but I'm pretty sure if you were directing a criticism to the director, he would say, well, PISA is run by a governing body of which every single country, with the exception of Brazil, I don't know for what reason they don't have a governing body on the test design, the design of the test, participates in this. So, we make recommendations, you're not bound to follow them. But the Guardian articles saying, well, yeah, you make recommendations, you're not bound to follow them, but yet we're seeing countries that are devoting significant amounts of resources to engage in this climb the rankings game, right? So, and I think John Jerem's research and mine, the earlier research I cited shows that, it's not necessarily just about attainment, it's also about recognizing educational qualifications, and that varies across countries. Richard Wilkins, I don't know if you know Richard Wilkins, he gave a very interesting TED talk. You might want to take a look at it. I think we actually have in our piece the link embedded, but it talks about income inequality and how income inequality is actually the starting point for determining all of these other differences. So, your previous speaker was talking about the criminal justice system. If you look at Sir Richard Wilkins' talk, you see how income inequality and crime, it's literally almost a direct positive or negative correlation in terms of income inequality and crime rates across countries.
Yeah, thank you so much. One follow-up final question, if we have time, was thinking about those low-income countries. One of those discussions basically is 15-year-old is the right age for all countries to be tested, given that compulsory schooling has been done. Are there any discussions or debates about those things? And the question content is collectively prepared, the question content, but should we be thinking about 15-year-old everywhere in the same way?
Yeah, and so when PISA was initially rolled out in 2000, they picked 15 years of age because that was the age at which most students were a year before finishing their compulsory secondary schooling. But as you mentioned, if you're bringing in countries and the list keeps expanding, you're obviously dealing with a number of countries where the student population might be more hidden. So I'll use Mexico as an example. In some cases, 30% of that student population is not reflected in the PISA sampling design, right? Or if you think about students in countries like Lesotho or Ghana or Nigeria, what are the percentage of students that are not attending secondary schools because those secondary schools have fee structures attached to them and not everybody can go to school. So this is going to be a consideration. Right. Just in terms of overall participation rates. But 15 years of age does capture it, and there's a bit of a gap there, right? So there's like a 10-month window or something like that in order to qualify. Oh, and by the way, if a certain percentage of students are excluded, those results are not reported. So there were sampling issues with the UK sample in 2000, and that's why those results were not reported.
Perfect.
If you get above, if you get above that number, you have a certain number. If you get above that number, then the results won't be reported.
Great.
Grace had her hand up.
Yes, Grace.
Yes. Hi, Louis. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was so interesting. I'm also in the camp of developing countries not using a benchmark against developed countries. But at the same time, I think I've always struggled with this question. I was hoping maybe you have some recommendations yourself. But given that lower income countries have less resources, and if they shouldn't, like I do believe as well that they shouldn't be benchmarking themselves based on an international level that maybe they can't get. Where do you think they should look to, I suppose, to be able to think of the new educational reforms they can do that works for their country themselves?
Well, I mean, it goes back to the earlier point I had made. I mean, let's look at something like achievement versus graduation rates. I think if you said to most people, it's probably more important for your high school completion rate to move from 80 to 90% or 60 to 70% than for you to move up 15 scale points on PISA, right? Because in the grand scheme of things, a high school student who graduates, we know right off the cuff, they're going to make 25% more income just overall. I mean, obviously it varies across countries, but you know, the economics of education folks say it's about 25% in industrialized countries, right? So, you know, and I've even shown this in my own country that, for instance, the provinces with the highest achievement scores, Alberta, okay, they have the lowest graduation rate. It's around 83%. Newfoundland, which is way on the other side, it's on the coast, has one of the lowest PISA scores within the country, has the highest high school graduation rate, which is 94%. So, you know, now we start having to juggle, you know, these competing interests. Attainment is important, but I would argue, and I have argued, that outcomes shouldn't be, educational outcomes shouldn't be reduced solely to achievement. We need to think about other things, not just high school completion or pathways to post-secondary education, mental health and well-being, physical health and well-being. I mean, does it really matter if the US moves up in terms of their achievement scores? They have the highest obesity rate in the Western world. Maybe that's a benchmark that they need to pay closer attention to. Type 2 diabetes. So I'm of the opinion that we need a much broader range of measures aside from achievement. And I think COVID has taught us that, you know, there are other issues that lead to a well-adjusted individual being in society. And, you know, the mental health and physical health stuff it matters. It matters to me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Louis and Grace. I don't think that we have any questions anymore. And it was a very nice note, last sentence to finish this talk. So we just want to say thank you so much for joining us from Canada and then giving this presentation. So
thank you. Thanks so much. I did my best. I hope I answered your questions to your satisfaction. I've emailed the slide deck to Berkay. The last slide I didn't show you has all the references. And most of those are actually available online. What I didn't mention is I have a book coming out that's being published by the European Union. It should be out in the next month or two. We're going to launch it in Brussels, and it's looking at policy monitoring. Unfortunately, it doesn't include the UK, but it includes 10 countries across Europe, looking at this relationship between policy monitoring in relation to different benchmark measures that exist.
we look forward to it, Louis. Thank you so much. So
Thank
see
you.
you. Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.
Now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Take care.